The one thing forbidden in the Iron Ghost's mansion was a secret. It was 2 a.m. when Min Seong, the most feared man in Seoul, returned from a meeting with blood on his cuffs. His guards stayed at the gate. He walked the gold-lit hallway alone, but then a sound, not a footstep, not a weapon, but a sharp, frantic gasp, came from outside his private study. He reached for his holster. Any other night, a shadow in the hallway meant an assassination attempt. Tonight, it meant something far more tragic. He rounded the corner and froze.
Please
There,
don't
trembling
leave.
against the marble wall, was his maid, Greta. Pale, sweating, looking like she had been caught stealing state secrets. But as she tried to bow, her grip failed. Clack! A small orange bottle slipped from her hand, spinning loudly across the polished floor to stop right at Min Sung's shoe. And it wasn't poison. It wasn't a stolen diamond. It was high-grade black market medication for end-stage lung failure. And when Min Sung picked it up, she whispered the words that cracked his composure. "Please, sir, take it from my paycheck. Just don't make me leave." Min Sung's jaw tightened. The silence in the hallway felt heavy. This woman, who he thought was just invisible furniture, had been working 20-hour shifts while her body was slowly shutting down. Now he understood the exhaustion in her eyes. Greta tried to reach for the bottle, terrified that her weakness would cost her the job she needed to keep her family alive. For a long, agonizing moment, the mafia boss said nothing. Then he quietly slid the bottle into his own pocket and did something that would terrify his enemies and confuse his allies. "Aw, you're done working," he said. But he didn't mean she was fired. Because what Min Sung did next didn't just break the rules of the underworld, it started a war. Stay with me until the end to see how a dropped bottle turned a cold-blooded killer into a savior. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. The plastic bottle felt unnervingly light in Min Sung's hand, a cheap vessel for something that clearly carried the weight of a life. He didn't hand it back. Instead, he turned on his heel, the leather of his shoes squeaking sharply against the marble. "Inside," he commanded. It wasn't a shout. It was a low vibration that compelled absolute obedience. Greta scrambled to her feet, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, like a marionette with tangled strings. And she followed him into the study, a cavernous room of dark mahogany and shadows, where Min Sung usually decided who lived and who died in Seoul's underbelly. He sat behind his desk, placing the orange bottle in the center of the green leather blotter like a piece of evidence. The only light came from a brass lamp, illuminating the label in Greta's trembling hands. "Speak," Min Sung said, his eyes scanning the foreign text on the label. Greta gripped her apron so tightly her knuckles turned white. It's nothing, sir, just a cold. The dust in the library. It makes me cough." Her voice was thin, fracturing at the edges. "I didn't want to disturb you with the noise. I bought it at the pharmacy." Min Sung looked up, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, suffocating and thick. He watched a bead of sweat trace a path down her temple. She was terrified, but not of him. She was terrified of the object on the desk. "A cold," Min Sung repeated, the words flat. "Yes, sir. Just allergies." "Since when do allergies require Silatrix?" He tapped a manicured fingernail against the plastic cap. The sound was like a gavel striking. "This isn't sold in pharmacies, Greta. This is a black market stabilizer for stage 4 respiratory failure. It's used to keep the lungs from collapsing when there is nothing left to hold them up." Greta's breath hitched, a wet, rattling sound that betrayed her instantly. Min Sung stood up slowly, looming over the desk. "You are lying to the wrong man. I know every drug that moves through this city. I know what this costs." He leaned forward, his shadow engulfing her. "You earn minimum wage. Then this bottle costs $3,000 on the street. You aren't treating a cold, Greta. You are buying time. He saw the fight leave her body. Her shoulders slumped, the lie dissolving under his gaze. The trembling in her hands wasn't just fear anymore. It was the tremor of a body running on fumes. "How long?" he asked, his voice dropping an octave, losing the accusation and finding something darker. "How long have you been suffocating in my house?" Min-sung didn't wait for her answer. He sent Greta back to the kitchen, watching the way she leaned against the wall for support when she thought he wasn't looking. She was a ghost haunting his hallway, fading a little more with every step. When the heavy oak door clicked shut behind her, Min-sung moved with the silent, predatory grace that had earned him his reputation. He didn't go to his office. He went to the servants' quarters. The room was smaller than his walk-in closet, stripping away the mansion's grandeur to leave only bare necessity. It smelled of bleach and something faintly metallic, the scent of old pennies or blood. There were no photos of family, no trinkets, no signs of a life being lived. The bed was made with military precision, the sheets pulled tight enough to bounce a coin. On the small chipped nightstand sat a single dog-eared notebook. Min-sung picked it up. The cover was worn, the cardboard peeling at the corners. He flipped it open, expecting a diary, tearful confessions or girlish dreams of a better life. Instead, he found a ledger. It was a chaotic, desperate spreadsheet of survival. Columns of numbers were scribbled in cheap blue ink, calculating every one of her meager salary. Rent for mother, paid. A sister's uniform, paid. Brother's tuition, pending. Min-sung's eyes narrowed as he turned the pages. The handwriting, neat and rounded in the beginning, began to deteriorate into jagged, shaky scrawls as the dates progressed. The numbers didn't add up. The expenses for her family remained constant, but a new column had appeared 3 months ago, labeled simply, "The Tax." It wasn't a tax to the government. It was the price of the Salatrix. He traced the final entry with his thumb. Income, 2,500,000 won. Family transfer, 2,000,000 won. Medicine, half dose, 450,000 won. Food, 50,000 won. Underneath the calculation, she had written a note to herself, the ink blotched as if the pen had been pressed down too hard. "If I skip dinner for 3 more weeks, I can pay for Marco's final semester before the winter cough starts. If the cough starts, I won't make it to spring." Min-sung closed the book. The air in the room felt suddenly thin. She wasn't just working for him. She was liquidating her own life, hour by hour, selling her breath to buy a future for people who would never know the cost. He looked at the perfectly made bed and realized it wasn't a place for rest. It was a waiting room for a funeral she couldn't afford. The morning sun through the kitchen blinds was cruel, stripping away the shadows Greta usually used to hide the dark circles under her eyes. She stood by the marble island, preparing Min-sung's morning tea with a mechanical precision that bordered on desperation. The silver tray in her hands rattled against the countertop, a tiny, rhythmic tink, tink, tink that betrayed the tremor in her arms. Min-sung sat at the head of the long dining table. Or his newspaper untouched. He wasn't reading. He was watching the doorway, his mind still replaying the jagged numbers in the notebook upstairs. Greta entered, her steps measured and slow. She focused entirely on the teapot, as if willing the porcelain not to betray her. She set the cup down near his right hand. "Your tea, sir," she whispered. Her voice was a ruin, raspy and thin, like dry leaves skittering on pavement. She turned to leave, intent on retreating to the safety of the pantry, but the air in the room seemed to thicken. A cough, small at first, escaped her lips. She clamped a hand over her mouth, her eyes widening in panic. She tried to swallow it down to force her traitorous lungs to obey the rules of the house: silence, invisibility, service. But the body, unlike a subordinate, does not fear the boss. On the second cough was wet and violent, a tearing sound that bent her double. The silver tray slipped from her other hand, clattering loudly onto the floor, but Greta didn't react to the noise. She was drowning in open air. Her knees buckled, her face turning a terrifying shade of gray as the oxygen cut out. Min-sung moved before the tray even settled. He cleared the length of the dining room in 3 strides, the iron ghost moving with the speed of a man used to dodging bullets. He caught her a split second before her head struck the marble. The impact he expected, the dead weight of an unconscious adult, never came. Instead, she settled into his arms with the horrifying lightness of a hollow bird. Through the starch of her uniform, he could feel the sharp ridge of her spine and the delicate cage of her ribs, brittle and unprotected. Like she wasn't just sick, she was starving. Greta's head lolled back against his bicep, her eyes rolling up, her breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. Min-sung looked down at the woman who had scrubbed his floors and polished his shoes, and for the first time, he didn't see a servant. He saw a pile of fragile bones held together by nothing but sheer, stubborn will. A will that had finally just snapped. Greta's eyes fluttered open, wide with the specific feral panic of the poor. She wasn't looking at Min-sung's face. She was looking at the phone in his hand. His thumb was hovering over the emergency dial. No! The scream was a wet, ragged thing that tore from her throat. She clawed at his wrist, her fingernails scraping against his Rolex. Please, sir, no ambulance. I can't pay the fee. Min-sung froze. He looked down at the woman bleeding oxygen on his kitchen floor. She was turning blue, her chest heaving like a broken bellows, yet her terror wasn't directed at death. It was directed at debt. You aren't breathing, Greta, Min-sung said, his voice dangerously calm. I'll sit up, she gasped, trying to push herself off the cold marble and failing miserably. A taxi is cheaper. Please, an ambulance is 3 months of wages. My brother, his tuition. Min-sung didn't argue. He didn't offer to pay. That would be a negotiation, and the Iron Ghost did not negotiate. He simply slid the phone into his pocket and scooped her up into his arms. She weighed less than the tactical gear he wore on assignment. The realization made a muscle in his jaw jump. He strode out of the kitchen, and ignoring the shocked gasps of the other staff members peering from the hallway. He kicked open the side door leading to the garage, the sudden influx of cold air making Greta shiver violently against his chest. Sir, put me down, she wheezed, her struggle feeble and pointless against his strength. I can walk. I can't go to a hospital. They'll ask for insurance. I don't have it. Min-sung walked past the rows of luxury sedans and stopped at the black armored SUV. The beast he used for war, not for errands. His driver, already sensing the shift in the atmosphere, scrambled to open the rear door. Min-sung deposited her onto the Italian leather seats. The interior smelled of sterile air conditioning and gun oil. As he climbed in beside her and signaled the driver to move, Greta grabbed his sleeve, her eyes brimming with tears of sheer financial terror. You don't understand, she sobbed, the fight finally leaving her. I have 17,001 in my account. I can't pay for this ride. I can't pay for you to save me. Min-sung leaned over her, his shadow blocking out the garage lights. He took her trembling hand, not to comfort her, but to stop her from fighting the inevitable. His eyes were dark, devoid of pity but full of terrifying resolve. You are confused about how this house works, he said, his voice low and absolute. You don't pay with money in my world, Greta. You pay with obedience. And right now, your only job is to stay alive. The automatic doors of the Hanseo VIP Medical Center didn't open for pain. They opened for platinum credit cards. When Min-sung strode into the lobby, carrying a woman in a cheap, The sweat-stained maid's uniform, the silence that fell over the marble reception desk was immediate and judgmental. Dr. Park, the head of thoracic surgery, met them at the elevator. He was a man who smelled of expensive antiseptic and arrogance, his eyes flicking dismissively over Greta's limp form. "Mr. Seong," Park said, stepping in front of the gurney Min Seong had commandeered. "We received your call, but there's been a misunderstanding. This is a private facility. We don't treat staff." Min Seong didn't slow down. "She's not staff. She's the patient. She has no insurance on file," Park said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper as he tried to block the corridor. "The ECMO machine she needs costs $5 million a day to operate. It is currently reserved for Senator Lee's wife. I cannot allocate a scarce resource to a domestic worker with zero collateral." Min Seong stopped. The gurney rattled to a halt. Greta let out a small, pathetic wheeze, her hand reaching out to grasp the air, finding nothing. "Zero collateral," Min Seong repeated. The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. "It's policy, Mr. Seong. We can stabilize her and transfer her to a public hospital in the morning. They deal with charity cases." Min Seong slowly pulled his phone from his breast pocket. He didn't look at the screen. He kept his eyes locked on Dr. Park's throat. He dialed a single number and put it to his ear. "It's me," Min Seong said into the receiver. "Buy the Hanseo Thoracic Wing. Yes, right now. The equipment, the building, the debt. Liquidate the Cayman accounts if you have to." He paused for 2 seconds. "Done? Oh, good." He hung up and slid the phone back into his suit. Dr. Park stared at him, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. "Mr. Seong, you can't be serious." "I own the machine now," Min Seong said, his voice terrifyingly soft. "I own this floor. I own the lights above your head. And as of 10 seconds ago, Dr. Park, I own you." He stepped close enough that the doctor could smell the gunpowder and blood still clinging to his jacket. "Get her on the table," Min Seong ordered, "and listen carefully. If her heart stops beating on your watch, yours will be the next one to stop. Do you understand the policy?" Dr. Park didn't speak. He simply turned, pale as a sheet, and shouted for the nurses to prep the operating room. The red light above the double doors of Operating Theater 1 hummed with a low electric menace. It was the only color in a world of aggressively sterile white. Min Seong sat in the VIP waiting area, a plush lounge that looked more like a hotel lobby than a place of anxious vigils, but the luxury did nothing to dampen the cold dread settling in his gut. He was alone. For the first time in 10 years, there were no guards flanking him, no lieutenants whispering updates, no dossiers to review, just the iron ghost and the deafening silence of a heart-lung machine working behind a wall he couldn't breach. He looked down at his hands. There was a smear of dried blood on his left cuff, not his own and not Greta's. It was from the man he had interrogated earlier that evening, before he had come home to find a different kind of tragedy unfolding in his pantry. Min Seong closed his eyes, his mind automatically cataloging data as it always did. He knew the precise location of the Viper Syndicate's safe houses. He knew the caliber of weapon preferred by the Triad enforcers in Incheon. He knew the exact boiling point of human endurance during torture. He knew the names of every corrupt judge, every dirty cop, and every rival kingpin in Seoul. But as he stared at the closed doors, a terrifying blank space opened up in his mind. He didn't know Greta's middle name. He didn't know if she had a lover, or if she liked the rain, or what song she hummed when she thought the house was empty. He didn't know if she preferred tea or coffee, despite the fact that she had served him breakfast every morning for 3 years. He didn't know her favorite color. She had lived in his shadow, polishing the floors he walked on, washing the blood out of his shirts, and he had looked through her, not at her. To him, she had been a function, a quiet mechanism that kept his chaotic life orderly. He had treated a living, breathing, dying woman with less consideration than he gave to his tailored suits. His phone buzzed in his pocket, likely his second-in-command, June, wondering why the boss had bought a hospital wing at 3 a.m. Min-sung ignored it. The vibration stopped, leaving only the hum of the air conditioner. He realized then that the Iron Ghost wasn't a title of power. It was an indictment. He was a ghost because he haunted his own home, dead to the humanity right in front of him. And if Greta died on that table, she would die a stranger to the man she had killed herself to serve. The most dangerous man in the city sat forward, burying his face in his hands, defeated not by a bullet, but by the weight of his own blindness. News travels faster than light in the sewers of Seoul. While Min-sung sat in the sterile purgatory of the waiting room, a message encrypted with military-grade keys pinged a server in a humid, smoke-filled basement in Gangnam. Kang, the erratic but vicious leader of the Viper Syndicate, stared at the tablet on his lap. The neon light from the karaoke bar above pulsed through the floorboards, a rhythmic, thumping bass that matched the adrenaline suddenly flooding his veins. Hanseo Medical Center, Kang read aloud, the words tasting like victory. Ward 404, confirmed? Confirmed, his lieutenant said, leaning against the graffiti-covered wall. Our source in billing says the payment came from Min-sung's personal liquidity fund. He bought the equipment, the floor, and the staff's silence. He's there right now. Guards? None. He sent his convoy back to the estate. He's sitting in the waiting room alone. Kang laughed, a dry, hacking sound. He set his drink down. The Iron Ghost, the man who moved with a phalanx of bodyguards even to buy a suit, was sitting exposed in a public building. It felt like a trap. Min-sung didn't make mistakes. He didn't leave openings. Is he injured? Kang asked, his eyes narrowing. No, he's not the patient. The lieutenant hesitated, tapping the screen to bring up a blurry security photo taken from the hospital lobby. It showed Min-sung carrying a small, limp figure in a black and white uniform. It's a girl, domestic staff, nobody on the radar, just a maid. The room went dead silent. Kang stood up, the leather of his jacket creaking. A maid. If Min-sung was laundering money or meeting a corrupt senator, that was business. That was predictable. But buying a hospital wing for a servant, that wasn't business. That was emotion. He's not sick, Kang whispered, a smile spreading across his scarred face. He's compromised. For 10 years, the Viper Syndicate had tried to find a way to hurt Min-sung. They had attacked his shipments, burned his warehouses, and threatened his men. Nothing worked because Min-sung cared about nothing. He was a machine of pure efficiency, but a machine doesn't sit alone in a hospital waiting room at 4 a.m. A man does. He finally found something he's afraid to lose, Kang said, grabbing his pistol from the table. He thinks he's invisible there. He thinks his reputation is a shield. He turned to his men, his voice dropping to a lethal hiss. Mobilize the Alpha team. Heavy suppressors, no badges. Cut the power to the grid first. I want the hospital dark before we breach. He looked at the blurry photo of Greta one last time. Don't kill the ghost immediately, Kang ordered. Kill the girl first. I want to watch him break before we end him. Consciousness returned to Greta not as a light, but as a sound, a rhythmic, electronic chirping that synced with the dull thudding in her chest. She opened her eyes, and the world swam into focus through a haze of anesthesia. White. Everything was aggressively, expensively white. She wasn't in the servants' quarters. She wasn't even in a normal hospital room. The ceiling was high, adorned with recessed lighting that mimicked a soft dawn. To her left, a machine the size of a refrigerator hummed, pumping oxygenated blood through translucent tubes that disappeared under her hospital gown. Panic, cold and sharp. I cut through the drug-induced fog. She knew what this machinery looked like. She had seen it in the brochures she couldn't afford to read. ECMO, life support, VIP care? Greta tried to sit up, but her body felt like it was made of lead. Her heart rate monitor spiked. Beep, 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 accelerating into a frantic tempo. She clawed at the sheets, her eyes darting around the room. This wasn't a recovery suite. It was a debt sentence. A single night in a room like this cost more than she made in 5 years. Her brother's tuition, her mother's rent, the food budget. It was all incinerated in the hum of the air conditioner. Stop. The voice came from the shadows in the corner of the room. Greta froze. Min Sung-seong was sitting in a low-slung armchair, his long legs stretched out in front of him. He looked like a statue that had begun to crack. His suit jacket was draped over the armrest, his tie hung loose around his unbuttoned collar, and his eyes were rimmed with the red fatigue of a man who hadn't blinked in 6 hours. He stood up, the movement stiff, and walked to the side of the bed. "Sir," Greta rasped, her voice colliding with the oxygen cannula in her nose. "Please, unhook me. I have to go." Tears welled in her eyes, hot and stinging. "I can't pay for this. You have to let me go before they charge me for the night." She tried to reach for the IV line in her arm, her fingers trembling. Min Seong caught her wrist. His grip was gentle, shocking her more than his violence ever had. "There is no they," Min Seong said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "I bought the machine. I bought the room. I bought the silence of every nurse on this floor." Greta stared at him, on the panic warring with confusion. "But the cost?" "The cost is irrelevant," he interrupted. He released her wrist and poured a glass of water from a crystal pitcher on the bedside table, placing it near her hand. He looked down at her, stripping away the layers of the iron ghost, to reveal just for a second the terrified man beneath. "The bill is settled, Greta," he said softly. "The debt is 0. Now you just have to breathe." The piece in Ward 404 lasted exactly 4 minutes. It ended not with a scream, but with a mechanical shudder. The low, reassuring hum of the central air conditioning cut out, leaving a sudden ringing silence in the suite. A split second later, the recessed dawn lighting flickered once, twice, and then died completely. The room plunged into absolute darkness, save for the rhythmic and terrified flashing of the red emergency strobe above the door and the green glow of the battery backup on Greta's life support machine. The steady beep, beep, beep of her heart monitor was now the only sound in the suffocating blackness. Greta gasped, the sound wet and panicked. "Sir, what happened? Is it a power outage?" Min Seong didn't answer immediately. He moved to the window, keeping his body flat against the wall, and peered through the blinds. The street below was empty. No streetlights, no traffic. The entire block had been gridded down. This wasn't a malfunction. It was a breach. "Someone cut the main line," Min Seong said, his voice dropping to a subsonic rumble that vibrated in the quiet room. "And the backup generator didn't kick in. That means they cut the hard line too." He turned away from the window, and the red strobe light catching the sharp angles of his face. In the strobing darkness, the exhaustion that had plagued him moments ago evaporated, replaced by the cold, metallic focus of the iron ghost. He reached under his tailored jacket and unclipped the safety on his holster. Greta saw the glint of the gun barrel in the flashing light. Her eyes went wide, the fear of the debt replaced by the primal fear of violence. Who is here?" "Vultures," Min Seong muttered. He walked to the heavy oak door of the suite and cracked it open an inch. The hallway beyond was a tomb, dark, silent, and waiting. He could smell it, the ozone scent of a blown fuse and the faint copper tang of adrenaline. They were already on the floor. He closed the door and locked the deadbolt. Then he dragged the heavy armchair he had been sleeping in and wedged it under the handle. It wouldn't stop a battering ram, but it would buy seconds. Seconds were all he needed. He walked back to the bed. Greta was trembling, her hands clutching the sheets up to her chin. Listen to me, Min-sung ordered, leaning close. His hand rested briefly on her shoulder, heavy and grounding. Do not make a sound. Do not disconnect those tubes. If the door handle turns, you close your eyes and you count to 10. Where are you going? She whispered, a tear tracking through the dust on her cheek. You can't go out there. Min-sung straightened up, adjusting his cuffs. He looked at the door, then back at her. The predator was back in the room. Stay in bed, Greta, he said, his voice devoid of fear. I have trash to take out. The hallway of the Hanseo Medical Center was no longer a place of healing. It was a kill box. The emergency lights bathed the corridor in a rhythmic, nauseating red pulse, turning the sterile white walls into flashes of blood. Min-sung moved with the silence of a shadow detaching itself from a wall. He eased the door to room 404 shut until the latch clicked, a sound softer than a heartbeat. He tested the weight of the suppressed pistol in his right hand and the combat knife in his left. Down the corridor near the nurse's station, a boot squeaked against the linoleum. Min-sung didn't breathe. He waited, his heart rate forcibly slowed to a crawl. A figure emerged from the gloom. Tactical vest, night vision goggles, a silenced submachine gun raised. The Vipers had sent professionals. The point man signaled behind him, inching toward Greta's room. He never saw Min-sung. Min-sung stepped out from the alcove of a linen closet. He didn't shoot. A slide racking back could be heard through thin drywall. Instead, he wrapped his left arm around the man's throat, crushing the windpipe instantly to stifle a scream, while driving the knife into the soft gap between the tactical vest and the collarbone. The man convulsed once and went limp. Min-sung lowered the body to the floor, catching the falling submachine gun with his foot to prevent a clatter. 1. 2 more shadows materialized from the stairwell, sweeping their lasers across the floor. They saw the crumpled body of their point man and raised their weapons. Min-sung raised his pistol. Pfft, pfft. The sounds were barely louder than a staple gun. The 2 casings tinkled onto the floor, spinning like coins. The men dropped, holes punched neatly through their visors. Min-sung moved forward, stepping over the bodies, his eyes scanning the darkness. He wasn't fighting for territory or money. He was fighting for the silence required for a woman to sleep. A 4th man popped up from behind the reception desk, leveling a shotgun. A shotgun was loud. A shotgun would wake her. Min-sung didn't hesitate. He threw the knife. It tumbled through the red-lit air and buried itself in the man's wrist. The shotgun fell from numb fingers. Before the Viper could cry out, Min-sung was on him, a blur of charcoal wool and violence. He slammed the man's head into the granite counter with a sickening crunch, silencing the scream before it started. The hallway fell still again. The only sound was the distant wail of a siren outside and the hum of the vending machine down the hall. Min-sung stood amidst the carnage, his chest heaving silently. He wiped a splatter of blood from his cheek and looked back at room 404. The door remained closed. The red light pulsed on the wood. Inside, the machines were still beeping their steady, rhythmic song. She was still sleeping. The war had raged 10 feet from her pillow, and she hadn't heard a thing. Min-sung pushed open the heavy oak door of room 404, the hinges protesting with a soft squeak that sounded deafening in the silence. The hallway behind him was a ruin of twisted metal and broken bodies, but inside, the air was still cool and sterile. The red emergency strobe had finally stopped, replaced by the humming return of the main power grid. He locked the door, sliding the deadbolt home with a click that felt final. He leaned back against the wood, closing his eyes for a second. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a sharp, throbbing pain in his side. He looked down. His pristine charcoal suit was ruined. A dark, wet stain was spreading rapidly across the left side of his shirt, just above the hip. One of the vipers had been faster with a blade than he anticipated. He hissed a breath through his teeth and pushed off the door, intending to clean up in the ensuite bathroom before Greta saw him. "Sir?" The voice was small, terrified, and undeniably awake. Min Sung froze. Greta was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide, staring at him. She wasn't looking at his face. She was looking at the blood soaking through his fingers as he clutched his side. "You're hurt," she whispered. The realization hitting her like a physical blow. She scrambled to untangle herself from the sheets, ignoring the IV lines tugging at her arm. "Oh my God, you're bleeding." "Stay in bed," Min Sung ordered, his voice gruff but lacking its usual command. He stumbled slightly as he moved toward the chair, the loss of blood making the room tilt. "It's nothing. A scratch." "A scratch doesn't soak a suit coat," Greta said, her voice trembling but gaining a strange, frantic strength. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet hitting the cold floor. "Sit down. Now." Min Sung looked at her, truly looked at her. The timid maid who flinched when he dropped a spoon was gone. In her place was a woman who had just realized something profound. He had left the room pristine. He had returned broken. "You fought them," she said, yet the words catching in her throat as she reached for the pitcher of water and a stack of clean towels from the bedside table. "You went out there for me." "I went out there to take out the trash," Min Sung muttered, sinking into the armchair with a groan he couldn't suppress. He let his hand fall away from the wound, revealing a jagged, ugly slice through the expensive fabric. Greta knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she pressed a white towel against the dark red flow. The white turned crimson instantly. She looked up at him, tears spilling over her lashes. It wasn't fear of the dead anymore. It was the crushing weight of understanding. He hadn't just paid for her surgery with money. He had paid for her safety and blood. The fourth pole rattled softly as Greta dragged it closer to the armchair, her movements slow but determined. Min Sung watched her through narrowed eyes, his breathing shallow to mitigate the throbbing in his side. "Leave it," he gritted out, trying to push her hand away. "The doctor will be here in a minute." "The doctor is in the ER with 3 gunshot victims from the lobby," Greta said, her voice unusually firm. She didn't retreat. She peeled back the ruined fabric of his shirt, exposing the angry, weeping slice across his ribs. "If you wait for him, you'll bleed out on this chair. And then who pays the bill?" Min Sung let out a sharp, surprised laugh that turned instantly into a wince. It was the first time she had ever made a joke, dark as it was, in his presence. She worked in silence, her hands trembling slightly but gaining confidence as she cleaned the wound with saline from the bedside kit. And the smell of copper and antiseptic filled the small space between them. For years, she had been the invisible force that cleaned his messes. The spilled wine, the muddy footprints, the occasional broken glass. Now she was cleaning the man himself. As she wrapped the gauze around his torso, her fingers brushed against his skin. It was warm, surprisingly human for a man called a ghost. Min Sung looked down at the top of her head. She smelled of hospital soap and faint vanilla. She was so close he could count the stray hairs escaping her messy bun. "You're shaking," Min Sung murmured. "I'm terrified," Greta admitted without looking up, tying the bandage off with a neat professional knot. "Not of the blood, of you." Min Sung stilled. "Why?" She sat back on her heels, wiping her hands on a clean towel. She looked up at him, and her dark eyes searching his face, finding lines of exhaustion and pain he usually hid behind a mask of indifference. "Because you aren't supposed to bleed," she whispered. "You're supposed to be the monster in the story. Monsters don't get hurt saving the help." Min Sung leaned his head back against the chair, the adrenaline crash finally hitting him. He looked at the ceiling, then back at her. The silence in the room wasn't heavy anymore. It was fragile. "Maybe I'm tired of being the monster," he said quietly. Greta didn't look away. For a long moment, the distance between the penthouse and the servants' quarters vanished. They were just two people in a locked room, both broken, both surviving the night because of the other. "Does it hurt?" she asked softly. "Less than watching you struggle to breathe," Min-sung replied. Greta's breath hitched. She reached out tentatively and rested her hand on his uninjured arm. It was a breach of protocol so severe it would have gotten her fired yesterday. Today, Min-sung didn't pull away. He closed his eyes and let the contact anchor him. The gravel of the driveway crunched under the tires of the armored SUV, a sound that usually signaled the arrival of a warlord. Today, it sounded like a return from the dead. The entire household staff was lined up on the front steps, a trembling phalanx of black and white uniforms. They stood with heads bowed, hands clasped behind backs, terrified. Rumors had bled through the mansion walls all week. Whispers of a hospital siege, of the master being shot, of the maid who had caused it all. They expected a firing squad. They expected the Iron Ghost to make an example of someone. Not the car door opened. Min-sung stepped out first. He moved a little slower than usual, a stiffness in his left side betraying the stitches beneath his tailored wool coat, but his gaze was as sharp as ever. He scanned the line of staff, his eyes lingering on the head housekeeper, Mrs. Choi, who looked like she might faint from the tension. Then, Min-sung turned back to the car and extended a hand. A collective, silent gasp rippled through the line. Greta took it. She emerged into the afternoon sun, pale and thin, wearing not her uniform, but a soft, cream-colored cashmere sweater and loose trousers, clothes that Min-sung had ordered for her. She looked at the staff, her co-workers, and shrank back, instinctively trying to pull her hand away and retreat to the service entrance. "Stay," Min-sung said, his voice low enough only she could hear. The driver, a massive man named June, hurried to the trunk to retrieve Greta's small, battered duffel bag, the sum total of her life's possessions. "I'll take that, sir," June said, reaching for the handle. "No," Min-sung said. He picked up the bag himself. It was a cheap, worn thing, fraying at the seams, looking absurdly out of place in the grip of a man who wore watches worth more than the van it was made in. He slung it over his shoulder, ignoring the shock that widened June's eyes. Min-sung placed a hand gently on the small of Greta's back and guided her toward the stairs. As they ascended, the staff didn't dare breathe. Mrs. Choi stared, her mouth slightly open, watching the man who had never lifted a finger for anyone carry a servant's laundry like a bellhop. Greta stopped in front of her former supervisor, on her instinct to bow kicking in. "Mrs. Choi, I'm so sorry for the trouble. Walk, Greta," Min-sung interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. He didn't look at the staff. He didn't acknowledge the hierarchy he was actively destroying. He simply walked past them, the master of the house ushering the lowest-ranking member through the front doors, not as an employee, but as a guest of honor. The heavy double doors closed behind them with a definitive thud, leaving the staff standing in the driveway, staring at the empty space where the rules of their world used to be. The study was exactly as it had been on the night the bottle fell. Dimly lit, smelling of mahogany and old paper, the air thick with the weight of unspoken decisions. But the dynamic had shifted. Min-sung wasn't sitting behind the desk like a judge. He was standing by the fireplace watching the flames dance. On the desk sat a neatly folded pile of fabric, the black dress, the white apron, the lace trim. Her uniform. Greta stood before it, her hands no longer trembling, though her breath still hitched in her chest. She looked from the clothes to Min-sung. "Put it on?" she asked, her voice quiet. Min-sung turned. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy silver lighter. He flicked it open, the flame springing to life with a sharp clink. He held it out to her. "Burn it," he said. Greta stared at the flame. "Sir?" "That uniform belongs to a ghost," Min-sung said, his voice low. She doesn't live here anymore. Greta took the lighter. The metal was warm from his hand. She looked at the uniform, the symbol of her invisibility, her silence, not her desperate need to shrink until she disappeared. She picked up the apron, the fabric cheap and stiff, and held the flame to the hem. It caught instantly. She dropped it into the fireplace and watched the black polyester curl and shrivel, turning into gray ash that floated up the chimney. When the last thread was gone, Min-sung walked to the desk and slid a thick manila envelope across the polished surface. It looked like a contract. "I have new terms," he said. Greta opened the envelope. Her eyes scanned the first page, expecting a termination notice or a medical bill. Instead, she stopped breathing. They were immigration forms, visas, flight itineraries. Passenger, Marco Sarabia. Passenger, Sophia Sarabia. Destination, Seoul, South Korea. "My siblings," she whispered, looking up at him, tears spilling over instantly. You brought them here?" "I expedited the process," Min-sung said simply, as if moving mountains of bureaucracy was a minor errand. "They land on Tuesday. The West Wing has been converted for them. Schools have been enrolled." He pointed to the final document at the bottom of the stack. It was a deed of residence, listing her name not as an employee, but as a co-inhabitant. "You can't work for me, Greta," Min-sung said, walking around the desk to stand in front of her. The iron ghost was gone. Only the man remained. "Because I don't pay family." Greta dropped the papers and covered her face with her hands, a sob breaking loose from her healed lungs. Min-sung didn't retreat. He stepped closer, and for the first time since he found her in the pantry, he pulled her into a hug, not to carry her because she was weak, but to hold her because she was finally home,